Marvel Comics are about to relaunch the X-Men line after the fall of X, the end of Kurt Cohen era, which I think has been very, very poor. I hope you're not reading all this stuff. Fall of the House of X, Rise of the Powers of 10, and basically everything else in it is not very good. But there is hope for X-Men fans that perhaps with Tom Brevoort coming aboard to be the new group editor and bringing some of that Avengers magic over to the X-Men line, that maybe, just maybe, things will actually get better. The more information I get from Tom Brevoort and Marvel Comics with their announcements and the information he's specifically putting out via his Substack, the more I'm convinced that this thing is starting from a place of failure, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the X-Men are, why the X-Men have been, for a very, very long time, the premier team book in all of comic books. Bigger than the Justice League, bigger than the Avengers, bigger than everybody is the X-Men. And I do think that Tom Brevoort himself is the fundamental destructive flaw in all of this. Dan Buckley probably thought he was doing what he had to do to save the X-Men line. Unfortunately, Tom Brevoort has already stated doesn't really like the X-Men, not really all that interested in them, wasn't probably interested in the job, took it because he basically had to. The more information we get about the creators, almost across the board, especially the writers, not very good. In fact, most of them downright bad. The titles that they're putting out there, not exactly awesome titles. The teams that are making up the titles, not exactly compelling. A lot of things in here, and you're like, I don't know if this is going to work out. But when Tom Brevoort himself talks about his vision for what the X-Men line is going to be, you can really see that he has no understanding of what makes the X-Men X-Men, what makes it special. He thinks the X-Men are just the Avengers, but mutants, and he's going to treat the X-Men line like the Avengers line, which is a completely different phenomenon. It's not the same thing. Yes, they're both superhero teams. Yes, they're both in the Marvel Comics universe, but they are completely different franchises. And I do think this is a terrible mistake. Marvel executive editor Tom Brevoort, who is in charge of the upcoming X-Men revamp From the Ashes, has stated the plan is to do more solo X-Men books than ever before, stating the X line has a huge diversity of characters, many of whom I believe should be able to headline a series, says Brevoort on his Man with a Hat Substack. It's all inevitably going to come down to how well stuff sells, of course, but I think I can confidently say you'll be seeing a lot more solo titles beyond Storm and Phoenix in the new X line moving forward, certainly more than have been historically attempted. There have been a ton of solo X-Men titles attempted over the years, and most of them have failed. Yes, there are a few standouts, and we'll kind of get to that. And that's the big difference between the Avengers and the X-Men. The X-Men is a team book that you can spin off solo titles into, while the Avengers are a bunch of solo titles that you bring together for the team book. It's a completely different mindset when you go into it. Iron Man, Captain America, Incredible Hulk, Doctor Strange, all these titles can actually sell their own as solo books. Now, they won't be the number one selling book. They won't even be the number 5 selling book. But they can, if done correctly, and if there's enough interest in the Avengers at the time, certainly sustain themselves over a period of time, upwards of like a decade, 2 decades on these runs, if done well, because they are good, compelling solo characters that have their own sense of identity, their own set of motivations, their own set of unique villains and all that kind of stuff. You don't really get that with the X-Men. The X-Men are a team book. They are a bunch of characters that come together for a common goal and purpose. It's not really to save the world from the biggest threats. It's to save humanity, from evil mutants, or save mutants from bad pockets of humanity. They are there for a specific reason. They've been brought together for that. So it's a different mindset when you come into X-Men versus Avengers. But he spent, 30 years? Something like that on the Avengers, moving himself all the way up to group editor, executive editor. He's got some pretty big titles at Marvel Comics over the years, but it's always been in that Avengers arena. And now he's coming to the X-Men line with the perspective of like a successful Avengers line, which is the wrong formula altogether. In a later edition, Brevoort elaborates on this in response to a fan who asked about the decision-making on which characters will get solo books. This is what he stated. This is going to sound a little bit arrogant or self-aggrandizing, I'm sure, Joe, but I'm going to decide, says Brevoort on Substack, and it'll be based on a number of factors, including which characters seem to have the best chance of selling a solo project, what creators want to tell stories about what characters, and what ideas for approaches for solo concepts come up, whether from me and other X-Men editors or else the talent pool as a whole. So traditionally, there's really only been maybe like 3 or 4 X-Men characters that can actually carry a solo title. And there's only one X-Men character that can probably carry more than one solo title. Although I'm not even sure if Wolverine could do that at this point, but certainly Wolverine is the standout X-Men character that can certainly hold a top-selling solo title. But he might be the only one that's left. In the past, you certainly had Deadpool could carry a solo title, but they kind of wore his welcome out, and they really just diluted the character and made him kind of lame. He's the Harley Quinn of the Marvel Comics universe, or if you're a DC fan, Harley Quinn is the Deadpool of the DC Comics universe. It's kind of that thing. You also had Cable, who could certainly hold a solo title. I don't know that Cable could do that anymore. He's had a couple of miniseries as of late, and he has not been successful. When you look at the roster of X-Men characters, it is very diverse. There's a lot of awesome characters. Me personally, I would love a Nightcrawler solo book. I'm a huge Nightcrawler fan, but I also realize that Nightcrawler, while he's an awesome character and he has a very distinct point of view and he has a story to tell, he just isn't popular enough to hold a solo book. I think Colossus is a phenomenal character. Colossus is awesome. There's a lot of stuff you can do with Colossus, but I don't believe that he could actually hold a solo ongoing title. Could he do a miniseries? Of course, you can do a miniseries with anybody, but there really aren't a ton of characters in the X-Men universe that are proven sales juggernauts or even good enough to continue on kind of sales kind of characters. I assume eventually once NYX is canceled, and I don't think it'll take very long for that to happen, they'll do an ongoing solo Miss Marvel book because they consider her an X-Men now. But that won't last either. That character has no staying power. There's really just, while the roster is awesome, it's a team book. It's a team construct. It's a team concept. And Tom Brevoort trying to take these individual members of a team and make them into a solo book, it's just not going to happen. It's going to blow up in his face. Interesting enough, he did talk about what he thinks maybe is wrong with the current state of X-Men as far as team books. Brevoort goes on to state that team books within X-Men can be bland from his opinion. Quote, past a certain point, a lot of the X-Team books have started to feel a bit like 5 random mutant characters who happen to be standing near one another thrown together as a team. And I think that's a really interesting point, and I don't totally disagree with him. I think he's got a real point there that I don't think a lot of people go in there with the team construction in mind. How are these characters going to play off of each other? Where's the interpersonal dynamics? Where's the interpersonal conflict going to come from? What's going to be the bigger picture? What are they going to be moving towards? What's going to break them apart? What's going to bring them back together? You know, with their past histories and, you know, their characteristics and all that kind of stuff, the way the characters act and the way that they're motivated and stuff like that. I don't think a lot of writers in X-Men have really thought about the team dynamics of the books for a very, very long time. But what's weird is if you look at his X-Men teams, you know, he's got the 3 big teams they're talking about. It's a bunch of characters that don't really make sense being put together. I don't know why Jed MacKay put that team together. You got Juggernaut on there, you got Magneto on there. It's like, what is the point of that team? The one team that kind of makes sense is Uncanny X-Men from Gail Simone, but they're also throwing 4 new characters with hidden mutations on them that nobody really knows to introduce them, while you're also having to highlight awesome characters like Wolverine and Gambit and Rogue and Jubilee and all these awesome characters that are going to be on that book. That's the better team, but it does appear that Gail Simone just put them together because it's like a known commodity, but then it's going to throw a bunch of other stuff in there for no particular reason, and then you got Exceptional X-Men, which is just a laughable concept. It's stupid. Like, it doesn't even make sense why they're portraying that or acting like that as the faux third flagship comic book of the X-Men franchise. Exceptional X-Men is going nowhere fast. NYX, another stupid team, going nowhere fast. X-Force, a book that has staying power, one of the better selling team books in all of Marvel Comics, let alone in the X-Men line. You look at the lineup, you're like, I don't get why you put these characters together. It's a fucking mishmash. It's a schizophrenic, like, deli tray of meats and cheeses that don't belong together. And you're like, I don't understand where any of this stuff comes from. So I do think it's weird that Tom Brevoort is criticizing the past makeups of the teams and them not making a whole lot of sense. But then you look at the teams that are in his lineup, one of them mostly makes sense except for the 4 new characters, and then all the other teams make no sense whatsoever. But this is the guy that's used to having the one book, Avengers, and maybe you get Secret Avengers or New Avengers and stuff like that. Maybe there would be 2, sometimes 3 Avengers team-ups at a time. but mostly it was a solo lineup of books. And I think he's trying to get his head around what exactly the X-Men are, and his idea is to turn them into the Avengers for some reason. It does sound like Tom Brevoort is well aware that most of this is going to fail. I actually talked about this with my good friend Doc during the Doc Unfiltered podcast on Patreon last week, but I did want to cover it here again. Thanks to longtime Marvel editor Tom Brevoort, we now have even more of an idea of the future of the X-Men line of comics. That is a new X book launching every month starting in July. This reveal was prompted by a fan question on Brevoort's Substack, specifically a poster going simply by Mark wrote in the Substack asking, can we expect more launches in August alongside Uncanny X-Men by Gail Simone and David Marquez? To which Brevoort responded, yes, Mark, and in September and October too. Ultimately, I'd like there to be some X Group new #1 every single month, whether it be a major launch or merely a more targeted limited series. And I do believe that's going to be very vital to this X-Men lineup that he's going to do, because he's already admitted Marvel Comics, and I imagine that's Peter Gabriel, have told him you need between 10 and 12 X-Men comic books every single month coming out. And when you look at that initial lineup, Wolverine will have staying power, X-Men will have staying power, Uncanny X-Men will have staying power, maybe X-Force will have staying power as well, but all 5 of the other titles, whether it be Phoenix, Storm, X-Factor, NYX, and there's another book in there that I'm forgetting at the moment, are all destined to fail. None of these books are really going to work out long term. And just looking at the titles and the teams that are on them with the creative teams as well, I don't think many of these last more than 8 issues. I think Exceptional X-Men will go past 8 issues out of spite. They will refuse to cancel the book just because they said it was a flagship and they don't want to admit so early. NYX will be lucky to make it to 6 issues. X-Factor will be lucky to make it to 8 issues on name value alone. Storm, the same thing. Phoenix, the same thing. There's a lot of stinkers. There's a lot of losers just with the creative teams and the pairings that they've done and the ideas for the books and the concepts within the X-Men universe, that they're all going to have to be canceled and either rebooted with another name or replaced with the new X-Men title. So I personally believe we'll be getting more than one new #1 X-Men comic book every month for the foreseeable future. I think that'll be going for a year, maybe a year and a half. And then maybe it'll slow down once they figure out what titles are actually going to have some type of sustainability outside of X-Men, outside of Uncanny X-Men, Wolverine, and perhaps even X-Force. Although this looks like just a terrible idea right out of the gate for that X-Force book, which should be the 4th pillar of this X-Men from the Ashes reboot that should be able to actually have some longevity, but they put a bad creative team on it with a really bad concept and an even worse team. So, you know, they're going to be running through titles and apparently a lot of solo titles, but I think they're going to be churning and churning and churning and realizing that Tom Brevoort does not have the secret sauce when it comes to X-Men. He doesn't have an understanding of the concept. He doesn't understand why people even like X-Men. He thinks they should just treat it like the Avengers, which is not going to go well at all, in my opinion. So, but at least he is at least preparing for the inevitability of the failure of this X-Men relaunch, because there are very few details about this that could even be considered interesting, let alone exciting. If you'd like more coverage regarding X-Men, lots more conversations about the X-Men relaunch, you definitely need to be checking out Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description if you want to go over there. Got lots of new podcasts going all the time. If you are somebody that likes the channel, wants to support the channel, but also wants tons of more talk about comic books, Thinking Critical Patreon is the place to be.